Welcome. You are beginning the first section of the course, Preventing Family Homelessness. This course is brought to you by the Family Solutions Collaborative. It was created by Alynn Gausvik, principal owner of the consulting firm Social Strategies. If you haven't already done so, please pause the video and go and complete the pre-test survey that was provided to you in the link with the invite. This course is designed as a foundational course for prevention. You will learn theory and research that defines current interventions. We will then explore how these interventions translate into local programs. This course encourages reflective practice to better serve households at risk. Follow along in your workbook provided. It has space to take notes, different activities that enhance the learning experience, and will overall help you to follow your learning progress. The universe of housing stability is massive. Preventing homelessness is bigger than any one program, but each program and provider is essential for what is required to end housing instability. Our view of this universe is the front lines. Our jobs are huge because we are battling societal forces. For the people we help, and ourselves, the crisis is now. But prevention is rarely about now. Let's look at the bigger universe of what it takes to stabilize housing. Zooming out, we can see all the different factors that go into ending housing instability and homelessness. This section is always evolving as we gain more experience, research, and data. If this is our universe, then these are some of the quadrants that we would need to exist to have housing stability for all. All are equally important, and they're definitely not the only ones, but we're mostly just going to focus on the housing quadrant. So what would it take for our quadrant to have diverse and inclusive housing and create housing stability for all? It would mean an adequate supply of affordable and inclusive housing. We would be preserving existing housing stock and creating policies for tenant protection. We would solve the existing homeless and housing stability crisis through eviction prevention, housing first, and low-income housing support. And then moving further upstream for more early intervention, meaning families would not need to reach the point of eviction to qualify for prevention help. So let's go to our prevention planet and dive deeper into its ecosystem. Prevention, at its most basic, is the act of stopping something from happening. Unfortunately, preventing homelessness isn't always so simple. Trust me, I already heard you saying it behind your computer. So let's start to break it down. There are two kinds of homeless prevention. We have universal prevention, which responds to societal root causes and creates interventions for whole communities. And we have targeted prevention with people directly at risk. There are 5 distinct types of prevention within this typology. Structural prevention addresses the root causes of housing instability. This looks like legislation, policies, and funding that makes housing for all a priority. Systems intervention work to change or eliminate institutions that cause homelessness. This includes exits from the justice system, child welfare, hospitals, and other institutional care settings. It can also look like changing policies that are barriers to accessible housing. Early intervention works with households at high or imminent risk. It can also mean working with households who have recently lost housing so that they can quickly restabilize and prevent future risk of homelessness. Eviction prevention is something we are going to talk a lot about. It is a form of early intervention, and it is one of the most practiced forms of prevention today. And housing stability is the long-term support for households with a history of housing instability, including homelessness. So where do we sit in this, and where are we really going to focus our time? We sit here with early intervention, eviction prevention, and a little bit of housing stability if we are lucky. Keeping our view zoomed out, we are going to look at the public health model. This model of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention has been used by public health to design many interventions for many different problems. In housing, a primary intervention would look like our Know Your Rights campaign an eviction moratorium, tenant protection laws, and poverty reduction strategies. Secondary prevention would be early screenings and intervention, eviction prevention for households at higher risk, and a right to counsel for people who are facing eviction. And tertiary would be our rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and stability for people who have previously been unstable or homeless. So how can we use this public health model to prevent homelessness? Public health uses 4 basic steps to define and solve problems. Let's get deeper into this and see what we can do. Our first step is to define the problem, housing instability. Under the social determinants of health, housing instability falls under both economic stability, meaning having instability in your housing will cause instability in your economics. It also falls under the neighborhood and built environment. This is your quality of housing, your access to transportation, the availability of healthy housing, and the quality of air, as well as your neighborhood crime and violence. These are all things that we don't necessarily have a lot of control over, but have a huge impact in how our environment shapes us. The second step in the public health model is to identify protective and risk factors. It is important to know that this is not an exhaustive list. Housing history, income security, caregiver needs, disability access, and a history with institutions can all create protective or risk factors for families experiencing housing instability. These are 2 sides of the same coin. Risk and protective factors can change over time. A holistic intervention will seek to take a risk factor and ensure enough support surrounds the family that resiliency can build up. This is not an exhaustive list of risk factors, but research has focused on the following: having less than a high school degree, having multiple partners that you have children with, having kids really young, drug use, depression, and low social support, being single, experiencing domestic violence, and having low employment rates, and having poor health or ever cohabitated. These are all identified as risk factors in the research. However, it's important to note that all research is impacted by how questions are asked and interpreted. We're going to come back to these protective and risk factors later. Let's shift our focus to evictions. This is one strategy developed to keep people housed. Although I know you're thinking it doesn't always make that much sense, and it doesn't really always lead to that much stability. The eviction process is usually initiated when a tenant cannot or did not pay rent, although this isn't the only reason. The eviction process is theoretically straightforward, but it doesn't make it any more simple for us to solve what's going on. A household can get evicted and never experience homelessness, and every day people experience homelessness who have never had an eviction. There are also many households who are unable to pay rent and find ways to negotiate keeping their housing. Research has not been able to show us a linear process from evictions to experiencing homelessness. Housing instability and homelessness are defined in many different ways and experienced diversely. Therefore, preventing this requires a diverse application of interventions that target families and communities. There is no single cause leading a household to experience homelessness. The pathways into and out of this are rarely linear. This doesn't mean that you aren't reducing homelessness in your community when you're addressing evictions and arrears. So let's talk about evictions again. Last year, there were 3.7 million evictions filed in the U.S. This is only the evictions filed. There is much less publicly available data regarding evictions that progressed to displacement. This has spurred a lot of program development around eviction preventions. This includes investment into legal services, homeless services, and community organizations. There's a lot of different funding from a lot of different places going to different programs. Preventing eviction is complicated, and it starts to get really difficult to coordinate. So while there may not be a direct pathway, there's a lot of evidence that prior evictions increase the risk of someone experiencing homelessness. Evictions are often triggered by many of the same triggers as homelessness. Many of the associated outcomes of housing instability produce the risk factors for homelessness later in life, contributing to multi-generational homelessness. Evictions can harm credit, disrupt schools, create stress that exacerbates violence. It is often the result of compounding risk, and as an outcome, compounds risk further. Housing is an equalizer. If we can stabilize families in housing, this creates a foundation for them to invest in themselves and their communities. Families do not experience risk factors in a vacuum. In theory, this is called cumulative risk. In practice, few families experience one type of risk alone. It's the different combinations of successive risk that can lead a family into housing instability and homelessness. An informal eviction is one that happens outside of the legal system. We haven't had very much data on this until recently. In 2017, the American Housing Survey began collecting self-reported information on informal evictions. They found that a greater number of informal evictions were reported, 73% out of all respondents. This compares to other forced moves where the formal eviction made up 13% and fear of eviction led 14% of people to leave their current unit. So what does this mean for those that are unlawfully evicted? Current eviction prevention programs usually fall inside the lines of formal evictions. Really what we could call them is eviction diversion programs. What implications does this have for the people seeking our services, especially when the families coming to us rarely fit neatly into these boxes? 2020 marked the first time in a decade that homelessness among families did not decrease in the United States. I want to acknowledge that family is a personal experience and is personally defined. It is never on someone else to define who is your family. However, programs often have limited definitions that restrict our interventions and lead some families without our services. Families who experience homelessness too easily become young people in foster care and adults struggling on the street. Intervening at any point in housing instability is a smart investment to break cycles of poverty and trauma. Housing instability has significant impact on children. When compared to low-income and homeless families, children experiencing housing instability and homelessness have been shown to have higher levels of emotional and behavioral problems and have increased risk of serious health problems. They're more likely to experience separation from their families, and housing instability has a huge impact on children's ability to participate in education. They may experience more school mobility, repeat a grade, be expelled or drop out of school, and have lower academic performances. And as we have discussed earlier, high school graduation is a significant protective factor against future housing instability. To really create housing stability in our communities, we have to address intimate partner and family violence. Statistics are clear that violence and homelessness are both cause and effect. This is equally compounded by child welfare and incarceration systems. For all of those systems, it is important that we have service integration and coordination. More to come on what I call the black hole of referrals. When it comes to domestic violence and child welfare, this means clarifying your role and theirs, having a plan, and always having the whole family as the center of decision-making and planning. Most research focuses on young people exiting institutional care. Examples of child welfare programs working upstream with families to prevent housing instability are relatively new. Those that do exist show promise for creating stable home environments. Experiencing housing instability creates a huge risk factor for child welfare involvement, and having your kids apprehended can start a cycle of housing instability and homelessness that is almost impossible to get out of. The experience of housing insecurity significantly increases the likelihood of child welfare involvement and further undermines child well-being. Without a safe or secure place to live, families face greater challenges resolving day-to-day stressors and providing safety and stability for their children. Children whose families experience homelessness are not only more likely to be removed, but are also less likely to be reunified. We need to focus our interventions on what creates stability. Promoting housing stability is promoting resiliency. Studies done in New York found that a variety of individual factors contributed to the request for shelter use, including childhood disruptions like being in foster care. But no one factor type was more prominent than the others. The researchers also found that access to subsidized housing was the only common factor among 75% of families who were eventually stably housed. When looking at our whole community and understanding that we cannot solve this in a vacuum, just like families don't experience this in a vacuum, that means we need to work with the whole family to design interventions, and we need to work with the whole community to access resources. Prevention research has grown and contributed to the development of interventions. The past few years, those who were working on this issue were starting to build a small but mighty corner of prevention. COVID-19 changed everything. This disruption has made the widespread adoption of housing stability interventions more urgent than ever. And at the same time, it has also created a political environment that prioritizes housing retention and production. The pandemic spurred several societal changes and policy interventions regarding housing. Employment benefits started to meet basic needs, tenant protections were laid out, and attitudes about home started to change. The eviction moratorium led the world of homeless prevention away from evictions only. Until now. The volume of people seeking housing assistance continues to increase. Government spending relies heavily on the infrastructure of our continuum of care to handle the inflow. Most recently, the distribution of rental assistance has reached bottlenecks and burnt out providers. Coordinated entry system prevention programs are not designed to solve housing instability on their own. This is bigger than us, but it doesn't mean you aren't essential as a part of the solution. Every single family that receives arrears is a family that has a chance to avoid the deepening crisis of housing stability. In our group workshop, we are going to dig into the local realities of your prevention services. We'll look at the tools and process that exist for funding to problem solve together how we can best serve families seeking services, regardless of that eviction notice or not. Together, we can build a best practice that feels like more than a check and a handshake, without making you feel like you are just taking on more and more and more and more of this universe.